So you might remember several years ago, a company called Aerial Adventures was supposed to deliver a game ball via skydivers to the University of North Carolina's opening football game, but the decision was made to cancel the jump because of the weather while the plane was in the air. But all of a sudden, the clouds moved out of the area and opened up, and the skydivers saw a stadium, so they jumped, and they ended up in Duke's Stadium instead of UNC Stadium. You never know where you're going to end up. How many of us in the sanctuary can say, I always knew where life was going to take me? I always knew where I was going to end up. How many of you in this are surprised that you're even sitting in this sanctuary this morning, that by some turn of events, you ended up in this community of Manhattan? The unpredictable nature of life is a given because we live in a world that is, as we know, constantly changing, one of fast-moving complexity. What seemed normal yesterday is not normal today. What seemed impossible yesterday is possible today. 25 years ago, who would have ever guessed that electronics would be where they are today, and that, according to a recent issue of The Economist magazine, there are 1.6 billion Facebook users today. And now, plans by Facebook to connect the digitally unconnected in poor countries by beaming internet signals from solar-powered drones and opening up even more its messenger service, which can already be used to order a Uber car. Even I'm able to figure out how to get an airline boarding pass on my phone and actually bring it up when it's time to board the plane. And this was like AI, artificial intelligence, or VR, virtual reality, and AR, augmented reality, are part of the vernacular. You never know where things are going to end up. Who would have ever guessed that the world would become as small as it is today with a simple tap of the phone to text a message anywhere in the world? Or opportunities readily available to our university students to study anywhere in the world. You never know where you are going to end up. Consider this election season with the candidates, the issues, the attitudes, the fears that stoke much of the rhetoric. Who would have ever guessed that we would have these scenarios that we have today? In an individual and personal way, many of us and many others have had experiences and episodes along the journey of life that took us in directions that we could have never, ever predicted. A field of work, for instance, in which you never thought you would find yourself. The opportunities that unpredictably came your way. The failures that you did not anticipate. The relationship or marriage that you thought you would never find. The unspeakable joys that graced your life. The tragedies and the decisions that caused heartbreak and sorrow. I was going through my notes the other day, and I came across a note about a young man, probably in his mid-20s, who stopped by the church one day looking for a place to spend the night. I had not seen the young man before. He had a plastic bag about this big, carrying, he told me, everything I own. You know, I thought years ago, this young man, when he was a child on a school playground, probably had no idea that he was going to be heading down this path. There's often a thin line, we know, that separates the nourished from the malnourished, the haves and the have-nots, the protected and the unprotected. In a spiritual sense, perhaps the fact that you are here in this sanctuary was never, from a spiritual sense, never on your radar. You never imagined your life taking a turn for being a part of a community of Christians. But something happened along the way that brought you to a new understanding of your dependence on the grace of God and your connection, your needed connection with fellow Christians. You never thought you'd end up as a part of a congregation and the people that you truly value and appreciate. Years ago at another congregation I served, when we took the confirmation class to a Western dude ranch in Wyoming, for their year-end trip. We stood around the campfire on the last night as we normally did, and with everyone given the opportunity to reflect about their experiences. And one of my good friends who I had asked, along with his wife, to accompany us as adult advisors, shared his thoughts around the warm fire that night under a star-studded sky. He said he never thought he would be where he was that night. He grew up in the East. He went to an exceptional prep school, then on to Yale, where he excelled in academics. He's a fierce competitor, was a goalie for Yale's hockey team, but he had mostly secular influences in his life and very little spiritual. He and his family had hardly any time for the church while growing up. Then he said something which grabbed me quite a bit. He said he never imagined that he would have a pastor as a good friend, ending up where you never thought you'd end up. When we look at our scriptures today, Paul ended up where he never thought he would end up. If someone had told Paul that he was about to become a Christian, Paul would have said, "We have counseling available." Now, a little background check on Paul will illustrate why he would have reacted this way. Saul, as he was known before his conversion, was a Roman citizen. He was a leader in his Jewish community. He was a very well-respected man. He was impressed by all the material blessings that Rome had brought to his people in the form of roads and bridges and aqueducts and harbors and trade. He was a beneficiary of all this, therefore a fierce defender of the status quo. A well-heeled rabbinical school prepared him theologically and intellectually. At the same time, he succumbed to a sort of student fanaticism they even had in those days, and he assisted those who stoned Stephen, a devoted follower of Christ who was promoting religious change. So when Paul set out to Jerusalem on that life-changing day, he was armed with letters of endorsements from the high priest authorizing him to bring back any Christians to Jerusalem and have a phony trial. Paul, you see, thought he was doing what was absolutely justified. He was, again, the protector of the status quo, a fierce defender of his nation's sacred religious traditions. That's why it was all that more unbelievable that the light from the sky knocked Paul to the ground on his way to Damascus and blinded him. Instead of rounding up Christians for execution, he ended up becoming the greatest missionary and the greatest pioneer in all of Christian history. You never know where you are going to end up. Moses had a similar experience over 1,000 years before Paul. This time, though, it was the Lord speaking directly to Moses, as Moses literally felt himself on the hot seat next to a burning bush. But it was not until after he fled the potential wrath of his captors for killing an Egyptian who had been beating up on one of his friends did he receive his call. At the time of his call, though, he stood in fear and bewilderment of his circumstances, and he would become the man who would form Israel into a nation and give his nation a clear identity. As a matter of fact, Moses was so perplexed about his calling that he said to the Lord, "Who am I? Who am I that I should go to the Pharaoh and bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt?" You never know where you're going to end up. The Bible is replete with characters. I mean, there's so many characters in the Bible that had no idea where they were going to end up. Moses and Paul being the most obvious, and a parade of others who ended up in places they would have never imagined. Consider today that Jesus, for instance, called Peter, Andrew, and James and John to his ministry. They were just out for a routine day of fishing. And all of a sudden, they found themselves immediately dropping their nets and following Jesus. Ordinary men who all of a sudden had an extraordinary mission. Who would have ever imagined that the Ethiopian official on his way home from a pilgrimage to Jerusalem would encounter the disciple Philip, who shared with him the good news of Christ? The Ethiopian official was so moved by Philip that he asked the question, "What is to prevent me from being baptized?" This is a good question for all of us. not in the baptism sense, but in the sense of the words, what is to prevent me from ending up where I thought I would never end up? In spite of the surprises and unpredictable circumstances of life, we do live mostly programmed lives. It's easy to find ourselves on sure and definite tracks with predictable routines every day, and that's not all that bad, of course, because out of routine comes productivity and security and familiarity. Days can be planned out, as we know, like clockwork. One leaves for work at a certain time. One gets home at a certain time. One exercises at a certain time. One makes the coffee at a certain time. One goes out for dinner on a certain night. One reads the newspaper at a particular time. One gets up at a certain time. One goes to bed at a particular time. One goes to the grocery store on a particular day and to the cleaners on another day. One woman was so programmed that one day, and this is a true story, while she was getting ready to take her husband to a commuter train in an eastern city, doing her normal things in the morning, making the coffee and getting the newspaper and finding the keys and so on and so on. She got in the car and she backed it out of the driveway. She drove the several minutes to the commuter train station, only to realize that when she had arrived at the station, she had forgotten her husband. She just put her forehead on the steering wheel and cried tears of laughter. We know that systems and routines can be good and productive things, but they also can stand in the way, my friends, of opportunity. Much of life's challenge and fun is ending up where you never thought you'd end up. And no age demographic is impervious to this reality. Stories as Moses and Paul, although they are legendary and they happened centuries ago, they are still intended to inspire us. Imagine how moved and stunned Moses and Paul's contemporaries must have been when they learned of Moses' and Paul's new callings. Nobody ever thought that these two men would have ended up where they ended up. But this is a big part of life, which makes it interesting and challenging. If you are a young person in the pews this morning, if you're a student at the university, and you think you have your life charted out just the way you want it, the career you are shooting for, the area of the country in which you want to live, the age at which you want to marry, the path you want to follow in order to assure material success, if you are thinking this way, that's great. But always remain open to the special calling that God may have for you at this stage in your life. It may be a mission opportunity overseas. It may be an assignment in one of the inner cities of America, or an entrepreneurial idea that would help a lot of people. Never place limitations on yourselves to do the things that you feel you are called to do. I'm sure my daughter, for instance, in her early years of college, never imagined that she would end up living for 8 years in the Eastern Congo. If you are in your middle ages, never stop wondering if there may be a special calling for you. Never become so programmed that you lose sight of the beautiful mountains and meadows that you know are out there. You just can't see them quite yet from your front porch. You read the scriptures. Become involved in your own personal prayer. Allow God's Spirit to move within you. Not unlike the family several years ago who just picked up and left California and moved to Kigali, Rwanda. He was a civil engineer who made a commitment of working 1 year to help the city build sidewalks. If you are in your retirement years, keep your options open, as they would say. In this case, the option to serve your faith in a way that you had never imagined. It may involve a complete shakeup of your life. It may involve a relocation, a challenge that you've never had before, or an opportunity to serve others in ways that you are able to serve. Never count yourself out. It could change your life. In our text the Lord said to Ananias, a disciple in Damascus, to lay his hands on Paul that he may regain his sight after he was blinded on the road to Damascus. The Lord told him to go and do it because Paul, you see, is a chosen instrument of mine. Young, middle-aged, in your retirement years, always remain open to God's calling you as his chosen instrument. You never know where you're going to end up. It's the beauty of life. Amen.